Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'm reading a chapter from the book Micronation, Chapter 11, Battle for Freedom. So it turned out that the concept of a micronation had been around for a long time. Their concept and short history were well written out in their constitution. The first serious attempt at it had been after World War II. Sealand was the first modern one, though of course nations or groups of people had been declaring themselves independent for as long as there were people. For example, the Principality of Baldonia was founded in 1945. The nation was a tiny island owned by Russell Arundel, the chairman of Pepsi. Bardonia's population was 70 fishermen, but it had a charter, issued coinage, and claimed to have a consulate in Washington, D.C. That consulate had listed in the phone book. As a result, Russell Arundel, the owner, was often able to show up in full diplomatic regalia at parties that mistook him as an ambassador for another country, all because they based their research on looking in the phone book. Sealand was obviously different. It was built on an abandoned World War II weapons platform. It had its own illegal radio station, coinage, and constitution. It had numerous governments over the years, and it is not recognized by any other state. Most international lawyers think that the requirements to define a state is either constitutive or declaratory. A declaratory state simply has to call itself such. A constitutive theory simply states that other nations must formally recognize the sovereignty of another. Various international treaties have been attempted to close this loophole. They've called artificial islands sunken ships instead of islands, thus applicable to the law of the sea in any nation that cares to claim them. However, governments tend not to like micronations. A mysterious fire occurred in 2006 in which Sealand's activities were severely curtailed. The Republic of Rhode Island, which was set up in the Adriatic, was flat out seized and destroyed by the Italian Navy. The Republic of Minervia, founded in 1972, was actually completely grabbed by the Republic of Tonga, with various other nations and groups fighting over the remains. When I read all of that, I could understand how Ferret might be worried that some people might try and steal the island. It certainly caused an uproar. The stock price for the 5 founding companies fluctuated randomly. Sometimes it tanked, and then suddenly turned around and became insanely high. Whenever it hit one of the low parts of the cycle, the founders would buy up a large chunk of stock. Apparently, they had been ready for such a development. Still, this was not just a bunch of crazy people founding their own abandoned island in the middle of nowhere. This was a matter of billions of dollars, and the attention of the public was definitely captured. Talking heads debated for days about whether or not Hler had the right to do what they had done. Various nations that Ferret had been bribing or stringing along through his legal shell game came out of the floor of the United Nations and demanded satisfaction. Generally speaking, the smaller the nation, and the louder and more obnoxious they were, the more frightening response came from the larger nations themselves. Silence. Prow and I had watched the television for those first few weeks quite a bit. Neither of us was entirely sure what to make of it all. About a third of the subcontractors just pulled up and left, and some of the other citizens did it so a short while later. I kept waiting for Prow to do his job and find something, but he kept just staring at the TV or occasionally the internet. He absolutely refused to solve problems without a filter, and I would not do. I considered getting him another one, but given the fact that half the employees were leaving and that anyone I could ask probably had a million things to do, didn't make it any easier. Still, I had to do something. Then an idea hit me. I went to talk to Prow. "Hey, idiot," I said as I walked in the room behind him. I suppose I could have used softer language. Prow, intensely engrossed in a Sherlock Holmes novel, grunted at an acknowledgement of my presence but didn't say anything. "Need a filter for the data of subjects or topics that interest you, right?" Prow's eyebrows rose up. "Excuse me. You need a Darla." Prow got a particular frown on his face I'd never seen before. "What?" I could tell he was not happy with this. There were several different expressions on his face now, mostly hard to read. Finally, Prow said, "I do not need a Darla, as you put it." It was at this point that I remembered that Prow was the supreme king of denial. He didn't think he needed a Watson, after all. He just tried to fire me numerous times. Oh, he felt he needed me once he found a case or something when I wasn't there. But when I was available and he wasn't hunting something, I was now totally expendable. Great. Right, well, I'm not in the mood to play this game, idiot. I was surprised at the harshness of my language. I mean, sure, I thought he was an idiot, but I usually tried to at least avoid conflict, kind of. Look, you need a filter. You've never, ever solved or even chosen a case without someone there to filter it for you. Prow bristled. I am not a child. There are several cases I have taken on my own initiative without a filter. Thank you very much. Name one. I believe my interest in the demon muffins was entirely my own observation. He sounded quite smug. For a moment, I thought he had a point, but then I thought about it. No, you didn't. It was Amberlove that found them, and for that matter, Darla was with you. And face it, you might have noticed the muffins, but Amberlove first brought them to your attention. Prow's jaw tightened. Do you have any idea how insulting you sound right now? I laughed. He stood up and laughed. There was no reasoning with the infant in this state. I returned to my apartment and relaxed. Gerald had been true to his word. The apartments were luxurious. I turned on the television and saw more talking heads. At this point, I considered leaving. Sure, the pay was good, but those entrepreneurial opportunities I had been expecting weren't turning up. Then it hit me. Half the population was moving out, and I was getting nothing done with Prow. Maybe another job had opened up. I'd gotten lazy when working with Prow. It was time to start living as a working man again. Then an even bolder idea hit me. When I'd been working as a technical writer, I usually went through various agencies. They found me a job, and in exchange, they took a percentage of my pay. But after my last job, I had decided to go into business for myself entirely. More money, more information, upfront about the contract. Why not start a business here? Why not start several? Nature abhorred a vacuum, and surely there had to be people out there stupid enough to come here and work for me. And I also happened to have an inside pipeline of information with the top man himself. Why not? So I went to the nearest equivalent that Hler had to a chamber of commerce to get a business permit. Turns out they had set the primary fee rather high. I didn't have that kind of cash lying around. The system was designed to work by having subcontracts under main contractors, almost like a feudal linkage to corporations. After some examination of the situation, I found out that you could get a license under one of the 5 founding companies for a lot less. It wasn't all that hard, really. Some paperwork, a few phone calls to a lawyer, and bam, I was in the computer system. They had cut the whole thing up in a bidding process that forced one to go as low as possible. I decided to start out small. I worked on a technical writing contract. It was a business I knew, after all. They had certain minimum qualifications, such as vacation days, insurance, etc. Apparently, Hler required that their subcontractors treat everyone under them as people. I liked that. I kept things simple. That first job was just me. I obtained the contract data and other information I needed, and suddenly I was earning 2 salaries. This might have been problematic under normal circumstances, but my position with Prow had entailed doing nothing the vast majority of the time, and gave me access to almost all the benefits that he had, which, for example, meant that if you were willing to live off the buffets, I had my food and shelter taken care of. Suddenly, annoying Prow wasn't as lucrative as it had been, but honestly, I was no fool. There might be another me out there, but Prow hadn't found him yet. Things were looking pretty good. At least they were until the Russian frigate started running exercises off the coast of Siberia between Hler and the shore. They just launched a whole bunch of missiles, but they sure got the point across. Suddenly, everyone on Hler, mostly, became even more nervous. People didn't want to stay in the middle of a combat zone. A lot of things ground to a halt. I considered leaving myself, but then I got greedy. I outsourced and contracted work for 5 or 6 different projects with people who I had met as a contractor over the years. At 15% of their salary, I was suddenly raking in the cash. Sure, I could die in flame and fire due to a missile attack, but until then, I would be rich, stinkingly, mind-bogglingly filthy, stenched up to the joint till your eyes water, rich. Well, I was on my way anyway. Time-wise, I still had a lot of years to make up for after my incarceration. 3 days after the first, the second frigate showed up and began doing the same thing, launching missiles that landed harmlessly out to sea. That just happened to come awfully close to Hler. No word came down from higher-ups, but I could tell that they were upset as well. They started visiting Prow on a regular basis, asking him if he had noticed anything unusual. Prow always sneered and waved them away. Amazingly, they left dejected. In practicality, it seemed, Prow was accountable to no one but himself. The attrition rate slowed down. In fact, we actually started to gain employees from people eager for their money or a thrill or danger or both. The frigates began a regular patrol pattern, always within sight of the complex. A lot of people knew that Hler had some kind of defenses, but none of the senior leadership responded to demands that Hler use them to make a show of force. After 2 weeks, I found out that being one's boss was not all fun and roses. One of the contract programmers I'd linked up for a project had done an absolutely stunning job of mediocrity. The client didn't like it and was a black mark against my company's name. I would have thought that firing someone who had done a job would be a bit of a power trip, but it just felt raw. The programmer begged and pleaded for another chance, and I couldn't give it. The client had already canceled the contract. Fortunately, the other jobs turned out well. In one case, it turned out fantastically, and the client was very pleased. Their praise more than counteracted any negative remarks against me on the Hler employment boards. Not bad at all. I decided at that point to start putting more of the money back into the business. Things continued like this for about a month. The Russians would rumble a few frigates around and act scary, and Hler would ignore them. The inhabitants of Hler were largely ambivalent by the end, and the talking heads had started to make fun of the Russians. Personally, I found this mindset extremely uncomfortable and dangerous. These were Russians. They weren't going to take kindly to a tiny little island nation making fun of them and thumbing their nose in the general direction of the Russian Navy. Ferret was appearing constantly on TV. He was bribing, i.e. pursuing democracy, with many smaller or poorer nations to get Hler to receive official recognition from the United Nations. So far, none of them had responded directly, but according to Darla, Ferret was making considerable progress in back channels. The Russians must have found out about it as well, because 3 days later they upped the ante yet again. A Russian aircraft carrier began scrambling fighter sorties over Hler. They began to swarming helicopters a few hundred feet above the complex, and they had camera people outside very visibly taking footage of anyone outside. Hler freaked. No one left. Once the helicopters started shattering the transports through the incoming plane, traffic slowed. Ferret was mad, and it looked like he might explode. I wasn't happy either. I had an investment in Hler now, and I wasn't going to back out so easily. I went to Darla's door and knocked. A short while later, an apish security guard answered to inform me that she didn't want to talk to me. Fine. I sent her an email. Darla, if there's something Prow can do about this, he needs you to feed him that data. Chester. Her response was rather interesting. Chester, go to hell. Darla. I've been there already. Try sharing a cell with your ex-husband for 3 years. Either you believe in him or you don't. Just because I am the only one that he says he needs to work doesn't mean that's true. Chester. I'll see what I can do. Darla. I knew then that I'd won. Unlike Prow, Darla could actually see reason if one applied enough pressure to bear to overcome her stubbornness. All in all, she wasn't evil or stupid. We just hated each other. So you can imagine my surprise when Lysol showed up in the office. He looked terrified. He had bruises all over him. He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Thank you, Chester. I'm not sure what you did or how you did it, but you got me out of there. Weren't you spying on Hler for the U.S. government? Yes, but after their Siberian operations center was exposed, they disavowed me. I'm no longer a real person as far as the grid is concerned. I don't exist. So Darla got you out of the Russian prison. Yes, apparently Hler has some very effective mercenaries that work for them. I wouldn't use the word mercenaries where we can hear it, Michael Onyx said, chuckling as he entered the room. Hired goons, perhaps? I said and smiled. They were paid well, make no mistake about it, but the Hler Defense Force is made up of people who are more committed to our cause than you are. They're citizens of Hler now. They're prepared to die for our cause. Are you, Arthurson? I could tell he was serious. He was just as serious when he moved over to Lysol and whispered to him. I had some men injured getting you out. We don't want to tip our whole hand this early in the game. That means we need Prow. That means you're going to use whatever tricks you used to attract his interest the last time. Everyone else but us has written you off. Serve us, and you'll be rewarded. Fail us, and you'll die right here with us. Betray us, and I'll kill you myself. Lysol nodded, terrified. It was obvious he got it. Michael Onyx didn't seem quite satisfied, though. Good, because before I would kill you, I would make sure you suffered. Very slowly. Lysol cringed yet again, and Michael left. I wasn't sure what the Russians had done to Lysol, but he was clearly a broken man. I had some respect for Onyx, but I didn't like him either. He was just a killer, a souped-up, slightly more competent thug. I left Lysol to weep and wallow in his misery. I entered Prow's private office and saw him calmly reading the same Sherlock Holmes novel I had seen him reading before. I tried very hard not to beat Prow senseless. I tried diplomacy instead. Must be nice. Prow looked up. Being paid to do nothing. I'm not doing anything, Watson. I'm sorry, Chester. I'm sharpening my scientific mind. Are you? Prow's brow furrowed, but he nodded. Yes. By reading a novel. Yes. I couldn't stand it anymore. You know what, Prow? You have everyone here fooled but me. They think you ought to be some great talent, but you're not really doing anything. Like I told you, he said patiently, though his voice was rising in anger. I interrupted. You're not going to pull that on me, Prow. Reading a novel doesn't sharpen your mind. I mean, it can, but that's not what you're doing. You're hiding and you're sulking. You want Darla to fill the role that you have pegged in your mind, just like you do for me. You know what? That was fine when you were a rich idiot who wanted to live in his own little fantasy world. It was stupid, but we were the ones taking your money. Oh, sure, we had other reasons for being there, but it was still a choice that affected us. It isn't about us anymore, Prow. It's hundreds of people who've staked their lives, their hopes, and their dreams on this place. Darla should be my wife. He was obviously at least somewhat facing reality this time. That was a good thing. I wasn't letting him off, though. Well, she isn't. And honestly, can you blame her? What woman in her right mind would put up with what you did to her? She sees something in you, Prow. Something I admit everyone else here can see but me, though I really think that that they think mainly they see it because she sees it. But that doesn't mean that she loves you anymore. Or even if it does, doesn't mean she can stay with you. Since when had Chester Arthurson become insightful into the nature of humanity? Prow moaned and slumped on his table. Darla, was all he said. You want to be Sherlock Holmes? Fine. Let's use logic. Do you really think Sherlock Holmes would act like this? These people need you, Quiescence. I hate to admit it, but I need you. If there's some mumbo-jumbo you can pull, or if you can somehow harness that God-given luck of yours, now is the time. I stopped talking. Prow just sat there. He stopped moaning. The light was so dim that I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or there really was a trail of drool coming from his mouth. Finally, he relented. Send in Lysol. And much to my surprise, that was it. Prow and Lysol came out after about 10 minutes. Prow sat pointing at a satellite photo of Hler. They're planning on attacking tonight. My guess would be early morning. So here's my dilemma. I know Prow wasn't a genius. Rather, he was not a genius in the conventional way. He had some rather amazing talents, but being the Oracle of Delphi wasn't one of them. What Prow was really useful at was a sort of mind detector. Basically, he was just incredibly lucky, because even though he guessed horribly, sooner or later, through that luck and sheer tenacity, he usually got to the truth or solved the problem. But the stakes were a lot higher on this. It had failed. If he had failed before, it was just embarrassing or amusing. It meant collecting more samples. Now people could get killed. So how did I do whatever it was that helped him be so lucky? Did I take this information to Gerald and Michael, or did I try and push back at Prow? I decided for the latter. Why do you think that? Look at the bridges on the top ship here. Or look at the ridges on the top ship here, Lysol said. There were tiny, knobby things on the end. I couldn't tell what they were, but Lyser answered for me. Those are 45mm cannons. They're anti-personnel weaponry. And I presume that's not normal? Lysol shook his head. No, it isn't. The standard Russian assault doctrine is, for the last 10 years, is to strike when it's darkest. Once they finally get all their troops in place, they strike in overwhelming numbers. Suddenly, I realized that this was not Prow. Prow was insane. Prow ran around like a heat-seeking missile in a furnace that hoped he got the answer. This was too logical. It was also quintessential Darla, or Lysol in this case. I looked at Lysol. He looked at me. Well, if the guy was planning on selling us out, better to find out sooner rather than later. I nodded. Works for me. Do you want to call Gerald, or do you plan to do so? Prow simply grumbled, you, tersely, and walked off. And so I did. Gerald was very pleased to have the information. A short while later, Darla, Ferret, Abraham, Gerald, and 4 other people I had seen on the signing but never met before showed up in Prow's office. Lysol told them what he had told me. Gerald nodded. Makes sense. Those anti-personnel weapons could wreak havoc on our defenses. Ferret didn't look happy. What can we do? We can deploy our Air Force. Interesting to confirm that they had one. Ferret shook his head. No, not yet. Not for something this small. Well, it goes without saying that we reinforce the wall, but I don't think that will be enough. It will help that we know they're coming. Ferret thought. I rather they don't come at all. How good is our sonar? Very good. Military sonar doesn't mess around. Could we get some people out there in scuba gear? Sure, it would be hard, but we could do it. Darla frowned. I don't like that idea, Ferret said. Why not? Ferret said, why not? Because it would look like a preemptive strike. We want to look like the good guys, remember? That means that we have to let them fire the first shot. Because it would look like a preemptive strike. We want it to be the good guy. We want to look like the good guys, remember? That means we have to let them fire the first shot, at least the first time. Ferret thought about it. Yes, I can see that as important. I think all your points are valid, but at the end of the day, we have to defend our home. Armed men are going to try and take our city. This is what we're going to do. I think the thing that surprised me most about how easily they about the whole thing was how easily they locked down the media. I mean, these days, every 2-bit hood with a cell phone and a web page thought himself the next Walter Cronkite. But Gerald was able to keep any broadcast from leaving the islands. I sat in the freezing rain, huddled next to a half a dozen nerds, holding a rifle. I never thought my contract included military service. Much to my surprise, it did. It was worded, "Take part in emergency protocol teams as deemed appropriate by the company." So when I was effectively drafted, I hadn't realized that shooting armed invaders was an appropriate emergency. The good news was that it was bound to surprise the Russians as well. They didn't have been expecting a light, highly trained mercenary force of 60 to 70 soldiers. They certainly weren't expecting a militia of 5,000. Of course, 1,500 of those were not Hler citizens, but part of the Foreign Legion. I made the argument that since Prow was obviously an analytical genius, they needed me by his side to do my thing. Michael Onyx had thought about that and then nodded. That's what radios are for. Thus, not only did I get a shiver from the rain into the hastily issued military uniform, but I got to listen to Prow prattle on in the comfort of their command bunker. I say, Watson, these night vision sensors are still amazing, aren't they? He apparently summoned the courage to call me Watson when I wasn't within physical striking distance of him. I turned the volume down to the point that if someone shouted at me, I'd hear it. Otherwise, I could easily turn it out. Prow just kept mumbling. Suddenly, a pair of spotlights came on. The Russians were coming over the wall. Their faces registered surprise that we were waiting for them. When I say we, I mean that they were obviously outnumbered 50-1. That and all the reporters had their cameras trained on the Russians. Cries of surrender went out into the night, and most of the Russians did. 1 or 2 soldiers swore and fired at random into the crowd, where they were taken out with immediate sniper fire. Quite professional. Of course, one might wonder at the professionalism of handing out thousands of rifles to people with no experience in using them, in the dark, in the rain in the dark. Fortunately, Gerald subscribed to the Barney Fife School of Military Training, which meant that almost anyone in the crowd had 1 bullet which they were to keep in their pocket until otherwise instructed. This had not stopped me from bringing 5 of my own guns, pistols fully loaded to bear. I wasn't facing Klingons unarmed. Things seemed to be going perfectly until the frigate launched 2 assault helicopters. They immediately shot a pair of missiles at some wind turbine towers, blowing them to smithereens. They were intended as yet another object lesson. I heard over the command channel that, translated, the Russians were demanded that we surrender. It was, at this point, that the well-placed explosives beneath both frigates blew up. Onyx had sent out a team of divers whilst everyone had been distracted. For a very tense moment, it looked like the aircraft carrier was going to start launching sorties, but nothing happened. Nothing continued happening. I, for one, was not the least bit unhappy with this state of affairs. The carrier started moving towards Hler. I'd never seen anything like it. You don't really appreciate how massive these things are until you see them up close. Larger and larger it loomed until finally it looked like it was going to ram us. Many of the men panicked and ran the other way. The news crews were obviously terrified, but to their insanity and credit, they just kept on filming. All around the world, people were looking at their television screens, saw a huge mass approaching the complex as we saw it. I continued running up the wall and taking a jump myself, but I knew how cold the water was then. I'd seen Titanic. Then, just as suddenly as it had started after us, slowly, ever so slowly, it crept up to the wall. Eventually, it came to a complete stop, but not before impacting the wall and sending out a low shock wave throughout the entire Hler complex. We knew they were here. The boat began to pull backwards and then to the side. It moved as close and as tightly as such a gigantic, ungainly thing could move. It was sending the clear, unavoidable message that they had so desired. They could have destroyed us easily. I got the message. I'm pretty sure everyone on Hler, except perhaps Prow, got the message. No one said a thing until the carrier was on the other side of the island, at least a mile away. It had come up to the wall, stopped, and then decided to leave, just like that. Then, the central control room patched an international news feed that was pumped to loudspeakers so that we could all hear. We will hold the corporations of Hler criminally and financially responsible for the loss of life and treasure this day. Still, we of the Russian Federation want peaceful relations with the nations who have innocent civilians on board their sunken ship. Hler, therefore, in the interest of avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, we are recalling our naval forces. Everyone began to cheer. It was a scene like one of those old newsreels from VE Day. People were dancing in the streets. Men kissed women at random, and then they kissed right back. The celebrations continued into the night and early into the next morning. While I found some celebratory companionship, I eventually decided I was too drunk for my own tastes and collapsed in my own room. Late the next morning, I found some woman's underpants at my room. Apparently, I had spent the night with someone, but whoever it was, I couldn't remember anything. They left no other sign of who they were. I didn't even have a phone number. The doorbell rang. I put on a robe and opened the door. It was Darla. She looked at me with a combination of surprise and disgust. Shaking her head, she said, "You need to come up to the board conference room. They're waiting for you." "Why didn't you just call to tell me that?" "Because the phone might be tapped." "That, and you disconnected it." She smiled slightly at that part. "Well, if she wasn't little Miss Virtuous Schoolmarm, I'll get it ready as fast as I can. Hurry." She closed the door and left. I quickly showered, shaved, threw on a work pants and shirts, and dashed up to the elevator. A few minutes later, I found the government board, Gerald and Darla. Chester Ferret came in. "Please, have a seat." I did so. Ferret looked at me sadly and said, "I'm afraid we're going to have to let you go." I couldn't help but cough in surprise. "It must be Siberian winter." "Excuse me?" "Apparently, Quiescence feels that your services are no longer required." He mentioned something about inappropriate language to his superior. Oh, this was rich. Fortunately, I knew how to handle this. "Oh, I do. I can understand the confusion. Prow seems to like it when I verbally abuse him. He's a bit of a masochist, you see. He says he doesn't like it. But the more I insult him, the more brilliant he gets." Ferret looked confused for a moment, but then comprehension dawned. Of course he was going to believe it. It still played to his basic belief that Prow was an eccentric and that Prow was brilliant. Still, I'm afraid his contract is quite clear. I held out my head and smiled. "Think nothing of it. He's done this before. I presume he feels that Lysol can fill my shoes now?" Ferret blinked in surprise. That wasn't at all going how I expected. "Why, yes, actually, but Prow doesn't understand himself well, and no one else understood Prow. The man was intelligent, maybe a genius, but if he was so flawed, they'd never get what they wanted. Prow's luck, and he had a lot of it, could fail. I'd seen it. Prow's luck had helped him the first time. Lysol had done the work the second time. If anything, Prow was a master of manipulation and deception. I was probably through. When he came back the next time, I would say no." Ferret said, "We'll make arrangements to get you out on the next plane." "What? Didn't you know?" "Know what? I'm a major contractor here now. Hler has made me a wealthy man. I'm here for the duration." Ferret actually smiled at that. "Well, welcome to Hler, Mr. Arthurson. Glad to have you." He shook my hand. What a weird thing to say. I shook his hand back, and "Glad to be here." Glad to be here.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary at the end of every chapter. I'm Rhombus Tix, and this has been chapter 11. So, yeah, if I was doing the easy button on this and trying to, somehow make this presentable to sell, I would pretty much delete this entire chapter. The boat thing is what I remember being the finale. No, it's not going to be anywhere near as shocking when it happens later on. the parts of this chapter really work well. I mean, I'm going to give it a B+. The combat is pretty good, albeit one-sided. Little itty-bitty random bits, like, for example, the background on Micronations, I enjoyed that quite a bit. How they basically got Larson to help to help Prow. How there was a way to keep to keep Watson around for a while longer, even though he was kind of officially done with Prow at this point. I think that if I had to do it over again, this chapter would be very short. I would find something else to cause the rupture between Prow and Watson and have the battle occur but be extremely one-sided and short. Basically just edit everything out about the boat. I don't think it needs to be there. I mean, don't get me wrong. As it is out of context in this chapter, it's very apropos because it shows the Russians for being what we've seen them to really be in the real world now, haven't we? I can't believe I wrote this thing in 2009. Some things I was way ahead of my time on. Some things have not aged well. But on the whole, the idea that if somebody makes a micronation, then the governments are going to have an issue with it and try and take it is pretty much shown time and time again. And I'm a lot different in my politics than I was when I wrote this, but, a fact's a fact. And governments are not comfortable with basically potentially pirate nations, that they don't know, that they don't have an embassy with. And, even the most seemingly benevolent country or a pacifist, you read about them and you find out, they took this city-state or this kingdom of XYZ in the 20th century, right? And the fact of the matter is that when I was researching the history of micronations, I'd found out that it wasn't just sea land out there, because most people have heard of something about that. There were a ton of these things, and a ton of people coming up with the idea of international waters, a ton of people coming up with the idea of using cruise ships. And, it's been actually tried since then and usually just terribly fails because most people don't anticipate as many moves ahead as the folks that put Hler together do. Hler eventually becomes the same organization that creates Asgard Station in my first novel. It's why they're linked. It's why this is a prequel. The secret society that basically ends up running the world is the conspiracy that Prow ends up helping because they seem like good guys. And on the surface, they seem like good guys, right? They want clean power. They treat their people right. The best bad guys are complicated, very complicated. And the Hler complex and techno-fascist corporate state that it creates is no exception to that rule. But here's where you see them at their best. You see them helping their citizens, but you also see them, drafting random contractors. And I'm frankly amazed that we haven't ever seen a corporation, actually put guns into the hands of its contract workers. But I'm sure eventually we probably will.